This morning, as I start out, I'm going to start with a phrase that probably, for the first time that I can remember in my life, made me feel old. I mean, I spent like 20 years as a youth pastor, so I've always said that kept me feeling young. When I was writing my sermon this week and I wrote down this phrase, I was like, ooh, now I feel old. And the phrase was simply this: 40 years ago. Just for me, contemplating that something in my life happened 40 years ago blew me away. It just seems like way too long ago. But it was about 40 years ago that I first really remember feeling called to go into full-time ministry. And so I pursued my education, and the first full-time ministry position that I had was working as a youth pastor at a small town in Western Washington. And as part of my time at that church, you know, I was a young guy learning how to be a youth pastor, what that meant, how to really connect with and communicate with kids and lead a youth group. And so I pursued as much extra training as I could. And one of the trainings that I went to, I met a man by the name of Clark. Clark was a super gifted trainer and teacher. And from the first time that I was in a training that Clark did, I was like, anytime I know that he's doing a training in this area, I want to try and be there so I can learn from him and just glean from his wisdom. So I was there in Western Washington for about 6 years. We moved down to California. I lost touch with Clark after we made the move. And then after about 6 years in California, we came back to the Northwest, and eventually I ended up as pastor at a church in Portland. And when I was there back in Portland, a mutual friend that I connected with in Portland let me know that Clark had actually moved to Portland, and he was now starting a nonprofit there in the Portland area. So Clark and I got a chance to reconnect, and eventually I learned a little bit more about this nonprofit that he was starting and kind of his passion for helping churches reach their community. And so we invited Clark to come to our church in Portland and spend about 6 weeks on Sunday nights training our congregation on how to reach out to our community. And I had no idea the impact that training time that Clark was going to do was going to have on my life. Because I still remember the first night of that training, sitting in our little dingy fellowship hall with the stained carpet that had been there for, like 40 years or whatever. It was a dingy, dull place. But we were sitting there around these folding tables, and there were probably about a dozen of us from our church. And Clark started teaching, and his teaching that night was about our calling as a local church to seek the shalom of the city where we were. And for me, that launched me on about a 14-year journey that's still ongoing today of just really diving into that word shalom and what that means and how it impacts our calling as followers of Jesus Christ. And it eventually led me to the place where I am right now, serving at Love Inc. as the executive director. And so this morning, I want to spend about the next 30 minutes talking about our calling as followers of Christ, to bring just a little bit of shalom to earth every day. And so if you haven't heard me talk about shalom before, I know that some of you have. If you have, don't check out. I promise. This is a completely new message about shalom. This isn't the same one you heard before. But if you haven't, let me just give you a brief summary definition of the word shalom, because it's going to be important for us to understand that as we continue on this morning. So the Hebrew word shalom, normally it's translated peace. The majority of the time in the Old Testament, when they use the word shalom, it's translated peace. It's also translated a few other ways. It's translated as prosperity, welfare, safe, or health, are kind of the general translations in the Old Testament. But as I've studied it and looked at the way that the Jewish people used that word, I think the best understanding to bring that to us today in 21st century America is when we hear the word shalom, we should think about it as kind of the general idea of welfare and wholeness and human flourishing. When the Bible talks about shalom, that's what it's referring to, a place where people are whole and they're cared for, and they can grow, and they can flourish, and be complete. And human history, I truly believe human history is bookended by this idea of God's shalom. You have at the beginning Let me get my sides right to match the slide. So at the beginning here, we have creation. When God created the heavens and the earth, he created everything. It was a perfect place of shalom. There was no sin. There was no sickness. There was no disease. There was no pain, no suffering, no anything. It was the perfect place where humans could grow and flourish. I mean, that was the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve, they existed with God in that perfect shalom. At the end of time, when God comes back, when Jesus returns and establishes his kingdom, once again, his kingdom will be that place of perfect shalom. So those are the bookends on human history. But there's a lot that goes on between shalom at the beginning and shalom at the end. So let me just try and explain that, or in the words of Inigo Montoya, there is too much. Let me sum up. You probably all thought I was going to say, you killed my father, prepare to die, but that would not fit in this spot in the message. So the way it works, okay, so we had shalom at the beginning, and then we have the fall, okay? So if you've read your Bible in Genesis, God creates the heavens and the earth, but Genesis chapter 3, there is the fall. Adam and Eve sin, and sin comes into the world. We now live in a fallen world that chaos reigns. We know that there is disease, death, pain, suffering, hunger, homelessness. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of the effects of sin that we see in the world. It is no longer a perfect world of order and beauty, but it is a fallen world that is filled with chaos. That is the world that we live in now because of sin. But God doesn't want to leave the world in this place of fallenness and chaos. And so God, throughout the rest of human history, has been working on his story of redemption. If you were here, I think it was last year when Kevin preached through the Bible and the story, it's that story, that arc of redemption that God is trying and working and endeavoring to bring shalom back at his kingdom eventually. And so he began in the Old Testament. God works through his redemptive community, the Jewish people, to bring shalom. And so that's their calling, to be a people of shalom. If you remember, I've talked about before in Jeremiah, to seek the shalom of the people of the city where I have placed you. That was the calling for the Jewish people, where they were to seek the shalom of those that are around them. And then Christ comes, and now he establishes a new community of redemptive people, and that's us, that's his followers, that's the church. And our calling is the same, to be about that redemptive arc of restoring wherever we are, just little tiny pieces of shalom. And so that's the arc of human history. From shalom to shalom, we're in the middle. We're supposed to be moving things along as God's followers until he comes and he returns and reestablishes his kingdom. And so when Jesus Christ came, his message was about the kingdom of heaven, about what was coming at the end. Shalom that was to come in the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, Jesus says, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, or the kingdom of heaven is near. That was the beginning of his message, and that was his message that he carried on throughout his ministry. And so in the book of Matthew, Matthew records one of the teachings of Jesus. It's one of the very first ones we have recorded. It begins in Matthew chapter 5 through Matthew chapter 7. And we refer to it as the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is delivering to his followers, to his disciples, this initial group of people that are beginning to follow him. If you want to come and be a part of my kingdom, this is what life in the kingdom looks like. This is what a kingdom life looks like. This is how you should live. Or to borrow a phrase from John Mark Comer, this is what a rule of life for life in the kingdom might look like. And so in just a few places in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus talks about the kingdom, we're going to highlight those, and then we're going to jump back to the beginning in verses 1 through 9. But Matthew 6:10, when Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray, one of the phrases in that prayer that he's teaching his disciples is, your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. The end of that chapter 6, verse 33, Jesus talks about seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father. So that's the whole kind of overarching theme of this message. chapters 5 through 7, life in the kingdom. But it begins in verses 1 through 9, actually goes down through 13. We're stopping at 9 this morning. But at the beginning, the opening introduction to this message that Matthew records, the Sermon on the Mount, is what we call the Beatitudes, what I read this morning. And if it seems like I'm talking fast, it's because when I preached through this, when I was pastor in Portland, I spent 2 months in just the Beatitudes, these 9, 10 verses that we're going to talk about. I'm going to cover it in about the next 30 seconds, the majority of that. So hang on tight. But to do that, I got to define a couple terms for you. Okay, the first one is, we mentioned it a few times, the idea of the kingdom of heaven. For the Jewish people, when Jesus talked about the kingdom of heaven, I want you to understand these are the things that they would have immediately drawn to mind. So when the Old Testament talks about the kingdom of heaven, this is what it's referring to. These are the things that it says describe the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is a time when disease will be gone, hunger will be eliminated, there will be no more oppression, no more sadness, there will be peace forever, there will be no more pain, and God will rule, and all will be as it should be. That's what, when I talk about the kingdom of heaven, and I'm going to use the terms kingdom of heaven and shalom kind of interchangeably today, but when I talk about it, that's practically what it looks like. That's what we're looking forward to. That's what life was like at the beginning in creation, shalom. That's what it will be like again at the end of time, shalom. The kingdom of heaven will be that. But another thing we need to understand is that the kingdom of heaven is a kingdom that is both now and not yet. It exists here and now, but it also exists in another form in the future. And let me explain what I mean by that, because obviously, in the future, the kingdom of heaven that's going to exist, those things are going to define it. No disease, no hunger, no oppression, no sadness, etc. But we all know we live in a world. That's not the world that we live in today. So that's the not yet portion of the kingdom. But the portion that is now is if you are a follower of Christ, if you have committed your life to following him, right now, God rules in your heart, and you are part of that kingdom. And as part of that kingdom, our calling is to do what we can in the world to bring a small bit of that kingdom, a small bit of his shalom to earth each and every day. Through our lives, through how we serve, through how we love other people. That's what we are called to do. So it is a kingdom that is now and not yet. And one day it will be fully established here on earth. Well, that's the kingdom of heaven. The second thing, if we're talking about the Beatitudes, the first 13 verses there in Matthew, we have to understand the word that they all start with. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the meek, those who mourn, and so on. What does that word blessed mean? Because it's probably not a word that you've used yet today or this week or this month or maybe in your entire lifetime. It's not a common word for us. And so let me define it really quickly so we're all on the same page. Blessed kind of takes three of our words and kind of combines them together. If you look at the Greek and Hebrew of this, that's kind of what they mean. The ideas of blessed and happy and fortunate. Blessed means all three of those at the same time. That's what's captured in our English word of that as well. And let me just give you a quick, I'm terrible at English and grammar. My family will tell you all that, but I'm going to try and give you a quick English lesson of how this word came to be formed. So three old words that have come together to form the English word that we use as blessed that really captures the essence of what's being talked about here. So the first one is the idea of being set apart or consecrated. The old English word blood or blood carries the idea of something that has been set apart or consecrated by a blood sacrifice. So that's the first piece of what it means for something to be blessed. It's been set apart. Okay, it's been consecrated for a unique purpose. It's holy. The second one, and you've probably used this, is to, to bless someone. That means to speak well of someone or something. And there's a Latin form of that, and I'm not going to curse you with me trying to pronounce a Latin word this morning. But there's a Latin form of that means to bless, to speak well of someone or something. And then the third one comes from the Old English word bliss, and that just simply means to be happy or joyful. So the best definition that I can give you this morning, putting all of those three things together, is that in the Sermon on the Mount, I believe Christ is saying that when we live the holy, consecrated, set-apart life that he's calling us to here, then and only then will we experience the happiness and contentment that God created us to enjoy. So holiness is the source of that peace, the satisfaction, and contentment, all the things that come with our word happy. It's like what Jesus talked about when he said, I came that you might have life and have it to the full. That full, abundant, joyful life is what Jesus is talking about. If this is the way to live, if you want to have the type of life that I came to give you. So that's what the kingdom life looks like, and that's what Jesus begins with. So let me zip through verses 3 through 8. I'm just going to give you, this is what Jesus said. This is the summary statement of what that means, and then we're going to get to verse 9, where I really want to dive in this morning. So verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit. That means we have to start our walk with God by recognizing our spiritual poverty, recognizing our total dependence upon God. It has to begin with recognizing our need for him. That leads us to blessed are those who mourn. When we recognize our poverty, our dependence upon God, we also recognize our sin, and that causes us to mourn over our sin and repent of our sin. Third, blessed are the meek. That means we live in humility. We recognize our dependence upon God, we mourn over our sin, and then in humility, we submit ourselves to God and obey him and put others first. So living in humility is meekness. Verse 6, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And Jesus is basically saying we need to crave righteousness the same way a starving person would crave food. That type, it's not just I'm hungry for pizza after church today. No, it's like, I haven't eaten in 40 days and I need something to survive. That's the type of hunger and thirst for righteousness that we should have, craving righteousness the same way a starving person craves food. Blessed are the merciful. In the same way that we have been shown mercy by God, we need to show that mercy to others. Verse 8, blessed are the pure in heart. In contrast to the religious leaders of the day, because for the folks in that day, they saw righteousness as an outward symbol. The religious leaders of the day practiced a ceremonial type of purity, and if they looked to be pure on the outside, that was what the standard was. Jesus is saying, and he repeats this over and over throughout his ministry, what's on the outside is not what matters, it's what's in the heart. It's being pure in heart. A purity of heart is what matters to God, and that only comes through Jesus Christ. And so that brings us to verse 9, where I really want to focus this morning. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And I want to spend a little bit more time here because a few months ago, this verse hit me in a completely new way, and I understood in a way I never had before. Because every time I can ever remember anybody teaching on this in the past, in fact, 17 years ago, when I preached this sermon through the book of Matthew, and I came to this verse, and I preached, this is what I preached that this verse taught. Because what I focused on was the idea that peace, being a peacemaker, simply means someone who is focused on resolving conflict. I thought about peace as just the absence of conflict between God and man, the absence of conflict between men, and that we are called to be a people who make peace, who help bring that type of peace, absence of conflict between people and between man and God. I mean, the reality is that's what the Greek word that Matthew uses means. Literally, it means a cessation of war, the cessation of conflict. So if you read in the Greek what Matthew writes there, it's blessed are those who bring about the cessation of conflict. So no more conflict between God and man. But here's the thing that struck me. You know, in different languages, different words have different meanings. And it's probably obvious to some people, but it hit me in a new way. You know, if you've been in church for any length of time, you've probably heard this illustrated if you've heard a message talking about the idea of love. And maybe you've heard in the New Testament, there are different Greek words that are used for love. The Greek had in some ways, they were very specific in their language. And so they had a number of different words for love. And the three that we usually talk about in church are, a brotherly love, phileo, an unconditional love that we should have as followers of Christ. That's agape love, or eros, and that's the love between a husband and a wife. So those three specific words, but they're all different words in Greek for love, but in our Bible, they're all going to be translated as simply love. And so we have to learn from contextual clues, what the different, what that means for us, or we have to go to the original languages. When it came to peace, the Jewish word for peace, shalom, has a pretty big meaning, as we've already talked about. The Greek word for peace is very specific. It means cessation of war. But when the New Testament writers were writing about peace, I'm firmly convinced they were thinking back to that Old Testament concept of shalom. And so typically in the New Testament, when you see the word peace, you're going to see it paired with another word. You're going to see phrases like grace and peace, or life and peace, and things like that, because they're trying to help expand the definition of what peace means in the New Testament beyond just the cessation of war. And so this is what it is that hit me not too long ago. When Christ was teaching the Sermon on the Mount, he wasn't teaching the people on the hillside in first century Israel in Greek. Jesus was a Jewish rabbi teaching a group of Jewish disciples, or folks who were potentially wanting to be his disciples, his followers. And he would have been teaching them in Hebrew. So when Jesus says this phrase, blessed are the peacemakers, Jesus is saying, blessed are those who make shalom, or who bring shalom. In fact, if you were to go and you look back now there's Jewish prayer books that the Jews use today that were being put together at the time of Christ. This is a phrase, to be a bringer of shalom is a phrase that's present in those prayer books today that were being put together, almost 2 millennia ago. So understanding that puts this verse in an entirely new light, because Jesus is not just saying, blessed are those who help resolve conflict. And yes, that's vitally important. I'm not denying that is a piece of what this verse means. I mean, in fact, one of the greatest callings of the church is to be a people that have unity together. I mean, that's Jesus' prayer in John 17, was that we, his followers, would be one in the same way that he and the Father are one. So the calling for unity in the body of Christ is massively important, and I'm not denying that application at all. But I am saying that in this verse, Christ is saying so much more than that. We're not only to be about making peace as we normally think of it, but Jesus is saying, blessed are those who bring shalom. Because our calling as followers of Christ is to bring a bit of his shalom to earth as part of his redemptive community, and to be doing that every day. One of my old seminary professors, Mike Wilkins, said it this way: shalom indicates completeness and wholeness in every area of life, including one's relationship with God, with neighbors, and with nations. April Holke Simpson, in her great book, The Blessed, writing about the Beatitudes, she said this. She said, so if, as is very likely, the concept of shalom is informing Jesus' statement about peacemakers, we must also understand peacemaking as an active pursuit of well-being for all, especially for those for whom well-being has been denied. So let's bring that into today. How do we do that today? How do we actively pursue shalom for those for whom such well-being has been denied? How do we actively pursue shalom? How do we bring peace? How do we be peacemakers for those who are hurting, for those who are marginalized, for those in our world today that are living in chaos? I love a couple of things that we've done here at Restoration. I know in the last year we've had a group of folks who've been involved going down to Roosevelt and just loving on kids there in a couple of different ways. That's one way to do it. It's just going and being the presence of Jesus Christ for people who may not see that anywhere else and whose lives, maybe because of their home situations or the financial situations of their family, have a lot of chaos. Showing them love and just being there and showing up and letting them know about the love of Jesus Christ just through our lives is one way that we can do that. Another thing Restoration has done for the last 5 years, they've hosted a Christmas party at Love Inc. for the folks who are in our long-term Emerge program. And we have a number of other churches that come together and provide gifts for those families because those families who are in that program have committed that we're going to live on a budget. It's going to be such a tight budget because we're trying to get things together. We're trying to pay off debt. So we're not going to do anything. We're not going to spend any money this year for Christmas so we can keep paying off of our debt and living on our budget and not going further into debt. So we have churches that provide Christmas presents for those families so they can still celebrate Christmas. And Restoration for the last 5 years has put on a fantastic Christmas party with food, celebration. Sometimes we've had the band come down and play songs, just all kinds of great things as a way of just bringing a bit of that shalom to those people, letting them know that they're loved, that they're cared for, that in the midst of sometimes the chaos that those people are living in, here's a bit of peace and order and joy that can come to your life. I mean, that's just a couple ways that we do it as a church. I know there's lots more, but how do we do that as individuals for each of us personally? Number one, I would challenge you, think about who God's brought into your life. Who's in your sphere of influence right now that is experiencing chaos in their life, that needs to experience a bit of God's shalom, that needs that wholeness, that needs to see God's redeeming work, bringing order out of chaos in their lives. How can you be a part of bringing a bit of God's shalom to earth in their life? Second thing, look for ways to serve, whether it's at Restoration, maybe it's serving with a nonprofit in town like Love Inc. I know we're always looking for volunteers. I guarantee you other nonprofits in town are as well. But a lot of those nonprofits, those are the types of things that we're trying to do. Find a place like that that you can serve, that you can plug in and serve our community. I mean, the mission for us at Love Inc. is to mobilize the local church to transform lives and communities in the name of Christ. That's our calling, to see those lives and our community ultimately transformed. And that transformation, bringing it more and more in line with God's idea of shalom and what it will be at the end of time in the kingdom. That's our calling. And if you're interested in that, we would love to talk to you and have you come and serve and join with us. And I know there's already a number of you that are doing that, and we thank you so much for being involved in that way. The third thing I'd challenge you this morning, learn how to help and bring shalom without hurting the people that you're trying to serve. We need to learn how to help in ways that truly bring a bit of shalom and wholeness and hurting and flourishing to the hurting and the marginalized. Because sometimes just giving people stuff, which is for a lot of us, that's our natural indication. If somebody needs something, we want to just give it to them and we feel like we've helped. But sometimes when we just give something that meets that need, in the long run, we're doing more harm than we are good. At Love Inc., we have a study that helps you process through and wrestle through the difference between what we would refer to as charity compassion, and that's just giving to meet a need, and what we refer to as redemptive compassion, that's helping in ways that are going to move people beyond their place of need to where they can ultimately help themselves. We refer to it as giving a hand up and not just a hand out. And this isn't to deny there are definitely places where charity, compassion, and giving to just meet an immediate need is necessary. But think about, is your meeting this need in this situation, am I simply sustaining this person in their place of need? And are they going to be in this same place after, if I give them this $20 to fill up their tank of gas, are they going to come back to me another month and say, I need some more money to fill up my tank of gas? Okay, I know $20 is going to get you like a gallon and a half. But, think about that. Is it going to sustain them in that place of need? Or am I truly learning how to help them in a way that's going to move them beyond this place of need where they can begin to learn to help themselves, and eventually they're not going to have that need and they're going to grow? Is it going to be a redemptive way, or is it just putting a Band-Aid on the problem? So at Love Inc., we have this course, Redemptive Compassion. We offer it at Love Inc. usually on Tuesday nights a few times a year. We also offer it to churches. If there's a life group that wants to go through it, or if a church wants to offer it, we are happy to share the course with them for that. And so if you are really serious about learning to help people in a way that doesn't sustain them where they are, but helps them get out of need so they can begin to help themselves, talk to me or give us a call at the Love Inc. office to talk about a redemptive compassion study that can do that. So I'm just going to close. Just real briefly, most of you have heard this, but a few stories of just people who have come to Love Inc. whose lives are a lot of times truly in chaos, who are hurting, who are suffering, who are sometimes marginalized, in great need. And we've seen God bring restoration and shalom to their lives. Sometimes it's a single mom who comes to us. We had a single mom a few years ago who was drowning in debt. She had over $40,000 in debt, could barely make ends meet. She was having to rent a room from her parents that she and her 2 teenage sons would share. She came to Love Inc. We walked alongside her. We helped her with as many resources as we could. And by the end of her time working with us, when she graduated from our Emerge program on Tuesday nights, she'd paid off all of her debt. She'd been able to save up enough to put down a down payment and buy a place of her own. She had a better job. And all along the way, she was just praising God for the work that he was doing. Sometimes it's walking alongside an addict who's in recovery. We had another young lady who came to our program, and she was actually our speaker this year at our dessert fundraiser. And she graduated from college. She got a job as a teacher. She had a house. She was a single mom with a couple of kids. And she got addicted to drugs through a series of circumstances. And in the course of about 3 months, she went from fully employed, owning a house with kids at home, to having lost everything and living on the street. And in her words, she was backpack homeless. And over the course of time, she finally got into recovery. Through recovery and a counselor there, she learned about Love Inc. And when she was able to get back into some housing, some clean and sober housing, and she needed furniture and supplies for her kitchen because she had nothing, she called us. She ended up coming into our Emerge program and stayed through the year, and now she works with us as one of our volunteers. And just the difference in her countenance, the joy on her face, and the love that she has for God is palpable. Sometimes it's just families who from the outside, they look like they might have it all together, but when you really get to know them, you find out they are drowning in debt. Hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes. Drowning in debt, feeling like I have no option but to go and declare bankruptcy. Over the course of the time that we've been doing our Tuesday night program, we've had a number of families who have come to us to do that. And thankfully, we can say none of those families have ever declared bankruptcy. They have learned how to get a handle on their finances and been able to walk back from that ledge and see that there's a light, there's a way that they can gain control of that. Sometimes it's a survivor of domestic violence who calls us and says, I left my husband, I'm living in a shelter now. I have an opportunity to get in to a place where I can be safe, but I have nothing because I left it all behind. Can you help me out? And we're able to come and in the short term, come alongside them. They can come and they can get the clothing that they need, furniture for their apartment, everything they're going to need to stock up their kitchen in terms of plates and pots and pans and those types of things. There's lots of different ways. Those are just a few for us at Love Inc. But there's ways that you can do it because you probably all have people in your lives who are hurting, who are marginalized, who are struggling, and who need to see a little bit of God's shalom in their lives, because that is our calling as followers of Christ, to bring a bit of shalom to earth every day.